don't do nothing. So whatever you do, don't do nothing. So whether that's saying, maybe you're at the beginning of your journey and you're just saying, I just want to know more about what the words diversity, equity, and inclusion mean. Great. Go check out the Culture Amp blog. We've got tons of content for you. Go read on Google. Go change your social media feed so you're not just following a bunch of cishet white dudes. Ask whether pay equity auditing is happening at work.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Engati CX. I'm your host Drishti and we are very excited to have you join us. On this show, we talk to CX and technology experts from around the world. We explore, uncover, and share fresh insights on creating experiences that your customers will remember and look forward to. Engati is the world's leading multilingual no-code digital CX platform, which is available across 15 channels with 53,000 solutions created across 186 countries in every domain and use case. Engati has also been recognized as a top platform by INC, Tech World, CIO, and many others. Engati also won the CODI 2021 award for the best AI-driven technology solution. We run the Engati blog and the video channel, and the Engati CX podcast, receiving upwards of 500,000 visitors annually. Now let's welcome today's guest. Aubrey Blanche is the math pad, that is Math Nerd and Empath, Director of Equitable Design, Product and People at Culture Amp, and a startup investor and advisor. She questions, reimagines, and redesigns the system that surround us to ensure that all people access equitable opportunities. Her expertise covers talent programs and accessible product development to event design and communications. She is the inventor of balanced teams approach and a culture of belonging, and the balanced team diversity assessment in the Atlassian team playbook. So hi, Aubrey, we are really happy to have you today on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here to chat a little bit more about equitable design and how we're trying to build a little bit of a better technology industry.
Definitely. So welcome to the show. And before we dive into the interview, don't forget to subscribe to Engati and tap the bell icon to get access to exclusive content from thought leaders around the globe. So beginning with the first question that I have for you, that you know that many factors contribute to the inequality of women in today's workplace, and many such issues are so deep rooted in our society and socialization as whole. So does this mean that, as some people argue, we can only expect real change on a generational scale?
That is such an incredible question. So I think that we can expect change on a generational scale. So we know, for example, that Gen Z is much more engaged in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion issues. But I think even in the immediate term, among the majority of the working class or the working sort of population now, we also see that millennials, right, which make up the majority of the workforce, are also demanding that organizations work more in line with their values. And so what we're seeing is there is a high level of valuing equity and valuing inclusive workplaces. And so what I think you're seeing right now is we're really at the beginning of a trend of organizations beginning to invest in these things. So maybe it's part of having to be an optimist to be in this field, right? To keep going in the face of what is a pretty big set of challenges. But I am optimistic. What we're seeing is that women, for example, in the United States are more likely to get college degrees than men. They're entering the workforce at a higher rate. The statistics in the US show that for every 100 straight white men who leave the workforce, only 66 are entering. And so what that means is just that the pressure on organizations to operate differently is happening. And macro data is telling us that companies are trying to figure it out, although they're clearly not there yet. So I work at Culture Amp, like you said, as the director of Equitable Design. And our research is actually showing us that companies have hired about 80% of their DEI professionals in the last 2 years alone. So thinking about that, that's incredibly huge. Doing this kind of work takes way more than 2 years to build an effective strategy and an effective cultural transformation plan. And so I'm hoping in the next 5 years, we're going to see big shifts for the companies that are smart enough to invest in this. So I think it's also important to understand there's going to be a lot of companies who just don't care about building equitable and fair workplaces. And what I would say is let them have the shittier talent. Let them have crappy cultures. Let them fail as businesses, because the ones that are inclusive are the ones that we want to be focusing on, the ones that are invested in becoming more inclusive. Not necessarily that they're perfect today, but that they're making the right investments and they're showing the right dedication to this work.
I really think, and the point that you made, and like the generations coming ahead would be always would be something that we look forward to, because that's a better generation that would be coming in. And now that it's social media and people getting aware and people turning woke, or at least trying to be woke, that's still very baby steps, like you said. But I think we have to be optimistic, and we just have to work towards that, so that we make a better place for even the upcoming generation. So I completely agree with you that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we're going to see a sea change over the next 5 years in a way that we've started to lay the foundations in the tech industry. You know, when Google came out with their first sort of diversity report in 2014, I think people thought that like reporting in and of itself was going to create the sea change. And what I think we're seeing is that while transparency is an important part of building an accountability strategy, it's not the only thing. And so companies that have often invested in things like what we call pipeline programs, so they're saying, well, let's get more women in to CS. And my answer is no, maybe you could stop discriminating the women that already exist out of CS first, so that those women you're bringing in have people to look up to, have, people that look like them in positions of leadership. Because what data shows is that 47% of women leave technical careers by 10 years into the field. And we know that that's not because women aren't interested in technical work, but often rather that the unsupportive and unhealthy environments are causing them, right, these incredibly talented, capable professionals to say, I don't want to deal with this bullshit anymore. I can go do something else with my brilliance that's not going to be quite as difficult. And so I think that's an important thing to consider in this work, is the companies that do this work really well, and maybe we can get into this in detail, but the companies that do this well focus first on culture, focused on fairness and promotions and progression and pay, and then start to think about recruiting and growing their numbers. So often it's let's just get folks in, and it turns out that's the wrong order of operations if you actually want to be successful sustainably.
Right, that's really true. So do you think governments should be doing a lot more to support equality, diversity, and inclusion within the workplace, also concerning legislations?
I would be a fan of greater regulation and greater enforcement of existing laws. So I think in many cases, speaking as a US based professional, I do work in APAC in the UK, but the UK is where I'm based. For example, our government bodies that are meant to look after discrimination are aggressively understaffed, right? So even of the complaints that come in, a vanishingly small number of them are actually able of being investigated and reported. So what we know is that even though there are laws on the books that prevent discrimination or are meant to prevent discrimination, we know that that doesn't necessarily happen because of the burden on victims of seeking administrative relief. I think it's also important, or what I would love to see is an upgrade in the way discrimination law in many countries is written, including the United States. So currently, discrimination law is what we call category agnostic. So that means, for example, that you can discriminate, or there can be like legal discrimination on the basis of identity, whether or not that identity is historically advantaged or not. So, for example, an over selection of Black people for roles is considered the same level of legal discrimination as the historical and ongoing over selection of white people for professional opportunities. And I think that laws that are more aware of the historical context will help us a lot, because we often hear about these claims of this fake concept called, for example, like reverse racism or like reverse sexism, which you can't have. It's not a real thing. And the reason is because those systems of power, those systems of oppression and exclusion, like racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, pick your flavor of ism, not only exist in terms of the differential experience of people in the present moment, but also need to consider the historical context of who's been marginalized and who hasn't. So I would love to see laws take that into account, because I think it would actually help us move away from the patterns that we currently see, which is that like white people tend to still benefit from all of the types of interventions and programs that are meant to create diversity and equity. And I think the law could bolster us in meaningful ways.
Absolutely, I think. And also when people, still get away with things like that. This is something that I read recently somewhere, that people or men thinking that workplaces now they don't feel safe just because women are outspoken. So the thing is that maybe you behave normally like men should, and maybe then nobody is going to speak against you. Like, why are you afraid of people being outspoken if you are not going to do anything wrong? If you are right, you don't have to worry about women talking about you or telling you that you have harassed somebody. Maybe you just don't do that. You eliminate that. So it's this phenomenon that people have, that when there are more people, or when there are woke people around you, and they will always keep on targeting these things and reverse sexism, or even with the racism thing. So that's not that's not how it works. People are normal, and when they have been oppressed for a long time, um, and they still do, it's not like it's just vanished and people are making false claims. So people need to understand that this is a part of inclusivity, and you also telling that you don't feel safe just because somebody is trying and speaking their mind is still a form of sexism that you are not able to understand. So yeah, I think this is something that people need to address on a, and if there are laws and regulations around this, people have to follow. So yeah, I
Yeah.
completely agree.
I think there's also this mindset. You brought up such a good point around like people in the workplace. So this happened like post Me Too. You saw all of these articles about like men are afraid to speak to women in the workplace. And I think there's this weird mindset where everyone is like trying to adjudicate like the line between sexism and not sexism. And I'm like, maybe instead of focusing on like how you can obey the specific letter of the law, you could just try to engage over here in the definitely not sexist space. So like instead of like asking the question, how shitty can I be without getting in trouble? You could ask the question, how do I be my highest and best self? And so that's one thing I would say is like, there's just this fundamentally busted thing where it's like, oh, I can't speak to women because they might like accuse me of sexual harassment. Maybe just don't say anything sexual to women, right? And then they won't accuse you of sexual harassment. Or if you're worried about something, if you're having a private conversation with someone, leave your office door open, right? Ask if that person is comfortable with you closing the office door, or ask whether someone is comfortable meeting you. You know, happy hour for work is a common thing. Say, would you be comfortable meeting for happy hour, or should we meet during the day for coffee? Like, these are such basic pro-social behaviors that I have a really hard time with people who are saying things like, this is so complicated. On the other side of the issue, and you like touched on this a little bit, so I just wanted to pull out like the threads of the great ideas that you brought in, is this other idea that like as men are usually fundamentally ignorant of a lot of the things they're doing that are having sexist impact, because they've been swimming in a soup of patriarchy that's intentionally meant to keep them unaware of these patterns. And so if you think about literally the process of learning anything else in the whole world, you're not going to be perfect at it right away. Like, you're going to mess it up. You're going to say something inappropriate. You're going to do something that harms or hurts someone. And what I'm not saying is like, you must be perfect from now on in your pursuit of like being your highest and best self. You need to develop some apology and accountability skills. But again, these are just like basic skills for successful adulting. We're not asking people to behave in other ways. And in many cases, as women, or I also want to be clear, like white people fall into this bucket compared to people of color, like non-disabled people fall in this bucket bucket towards disabled folks. So we all have areas where we like need to work on it and need to be thoughtful about the difference between being unsafe and being uncomfortable. So I think that's the other thing you articulated is people will say, I'm unsafe. And I'm like, actually, your safety is not in question. You're under no social risk. Like you're just having an amygdala reaction because you're uncomfortable. And you can have empathy and compassion for that, right? Like being uncomfortable is not pleasant. But at the same time, maybe if you realize that you could live through the discomfort, you're actually creating safety for other people. So I think a lot of this discussion is actually about simply raising the bar for what we expect of people from majority groups in terms of their pro-social behavior. Because like on some level, like when you're from a majority group, it makes you a little bit less empathetic because you don't have a set of marginalizing experiences. And so the right way to do that is to lean into your discomfort, whether that's your privilege guilt, whether that's feedback that you've harmed someone or not impacted them in the way that they wanted. But ultimately, it's going to be those types of skills that predict whether people are successful in the workplace and whether they can be allies and advocates. So my like TLDR for my very long rant on that, which you got me on my soapbox for, is like, one, stop trying to adjudicate the line and like raise the roof on the quality of experience that people are having. Two, be aware of the way that your privileges make you ignorant to these things. And so accept that you need to take a growth mindset and learn on these things. And then three, embrace the discomfort. So I can tell you as someone who's been doing this work for nearly a decade now, that I am uncomfortable basically every day at work. Whether that's because I'm like telling someone they've just done something racist, like someone who has great intention and their impact was just not aligned, to having to talk about my own structural advantages in the way that they impact me. But what I've learned and what I would emphasize for everyone else is like, you will survive the discomfort and you will become the person you're trying to be. And that seems like a pretty good payoff for like a little bit of stomach, nervousness.
That's such a good message, actually. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, is there anything that employees on separate levels can do to tackle this and put pressure on their company to become more diverse and inclusive?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that employees can do. So I'm a big fan of collective action. So I think it can often be very risky, whether that's perceived or real, for underrepresented people to speak out. So what I'd say first is for people from majority groups, they should be the ones who are primarily out in front trying to hold their company accountable, right? Use the power that you have. But I think in addition to the sort of formal advocacy, whether that's letters, whether that's getting leadership time, asking questions like, why don't we have a specialist on staff that focuses on DEI issues? So Culture Amp's research is showing that only about 40% of organizations across APAC, North America, and EMEA actually have dedicated DEI staff. And so what that means is that people are often doing DEI work as the second shift. So whether that's advocates who are doing like a second full-time job to do that, or your HR team that is, running HR operations and recruiting and talent and are trying to do DEI work on top of that. So the first thing that I would say is that companies need to learn how to value this work. So they need to compensate people for that work and they need to be paying for it. Because what we know is that from a research perspective, this pays huge economic dividends. So we see that companies that are more ethnically equitable and diverse are 35% more likely to outperform from a financial perspective their peers. Equitable organizations have higher retention, higher happiness, higher employee engagement, right? Like you could go down the list of like good metrics and almost all of them are positively impacted by this work. And so I think that's where I would also say, like, I would love to see employees demand that leaders that aren't competent in this work be put on performance improvement plans. So in the same way that we would think about a senior leader not knowing how to run a multi-million-dollar budget as a competency that like they should be put in remedial guidance for, why can't we say that inclusive leadership is a competency that people are required to have? And so I think we're going to see bigger improvements when companies basically start saying our leaders, not just employees, not just the folks who are more often advocating for this work, but our leaders are being held to a standard of behavior and engagement in this work that actually allows it to move forward. And I can tell you that that works because having worked at many organizations where I was able to make progress in my work, but I didn't see it as sustainable. So, and I would say this is true of my last role, where Atlassian did an amazing amount of work when I first came into my tenure, but ultimately didn't hold leadership accountable for those outcomes and historically underinvested in the function from a resourcing and dollars perspective. And what we saw is that that change, while great, wasn't sustainable. And what I'm seeing at Culture Amp, by contrast, is that there is a very intense focus on leadership learning and leadership accountability. So in 2020, after we released our anti-racism sort of transformation plan, our entire C-suite went through a half a year of anti-racism coaching, where we talked not only about what is racism, but how does it impact systems? Why is it the primary focus of our DEI program? And how does racism get built into technological products? And so this actually helped. What we see now is that our executives are engaged in the project of anti-racism at the company, whether that's personally responding to concerns that have come up from BIPOC employees, whether that's going out themselves and holding their managers to account to say, are you appropriately interviewing BIPOC candidates for this role? Are you looking at the composition of your team and holding yourself accountable for creating those equitable opportunities? Are you developing BIPOC employees in the same way that white employees are being developed? Our leaders ask, are we auditing these processes? How do we know that compensation is equitable? And so those types of pressures coming from leaders are ultimately the things that I believe make organizations successful. And just because we are recording, I want to say we do audit our pay, performance, and promotions processes for equity from a gender, race, and disability and caregiver perspective. And we feel really confident about the equity of those processes. And so to loop it back, it's not only that leaders are holding us accountable and that the organization is doing that work, it also then leads back to a more inclusive culture because you're able to communicate to employees. Here's how leaders are standing up. Here's what we're doing from a process perspective to create a fair and growth-oriented experience for you. And so what does that lead to? That leads to employees who have higher cognitive performance, who feel more engaged, who feel more valued and supported, which ultimately they're going to produce better work. They're going to do cooler things. They're going to stay longer. And that means that their brilliance is going to impact your bottom line. So this really is like a circular idea of investment, but it must start from the top, or it'll fall apart when your head of DEI is no longer there.
That's actually true, and the way that you said that, when the leadership is actually invested and they want to make a change, then it's very like that's the best sign of an organization when the leaders are looking to make a change, because like employees who would be on the most junior level, they can try and make a change, but they cannot, like, they cannot fight for this for the whole time and just stay where they are not comfortable. They'll just, what the most that they can do is just move on to a better organization. But yeah, but if I know that
I'm just so vehement. I'm like, yes, I want to like get a recording of you saying that and just put it all over the internet, because people always ask me, like, a common question that I get is like, what do I do if my leadership doesn't care about DEI? And I recognize that like this option is not available for everyone, but like get a different job. Like, pull a LeBron and take your talent elsewhere. Like, you are incredible. You're amazing. You have so much to offer. Like, don't give the benefit of all your brilliance to someone who is hell-bent on not seeing it.
Absolutely.
Anyway, sorry. I just team.
No, I was just talking on that point, that when the leadership is something that who is invested, then I think that accounts for a bright future for the company. that they understand all perspectives and they really want to make a change. They want their employees to be happy. So if employees come first, then success is going to come through. So yeah. So over the past decade, we have made strides to create better and fairer workplaces. But do you think um, organizations as whole are like putting emphasis on this issue today?
I think that we're seeing an incredible rise in the emphasis of this. So, all of the research that I'm seeing across everything from keyword searches on Google to B2B search volumes across different advertising platforms says that the level of interest in DEI in organizations has shot up more than 12,000%. So we know that the existing market for DEI is worth something like 8.3 billion and has a CAGR of like 59%. So that's all like nerdy finance talk to say like more and more and more businesses are starting to engage in this in the same way that we're seeing, 40% of businesses have a head of DEI or sort of a DEI staff member. But just in the last 2 years, 80% of those folks have been hired. And what we know is about half of the folks that are being hired now are being hired into leadership roles. So as opposed to taking a woman of color from your recruiting team and making her a diversity program manager for the ERGs. And I'm telling you, that's a very common way to get started. That's how my career in DEI started. So no hate, no shade. But what we're seeing is that companies that are really investing are actually bringing on senior leadership in DEI. So folks who have experience, who've run budgets, who know how to have a lot of those other organizational skills that actually predict whether you're long-term successful. And so I'm very optimistic to see an increased hiring rate of DEI leaders because those leadership roles often come with greater influence on senior leadership, budgets, resourcing of other types, more attention and focus from the organization. So I would say that I'm absolutely optimistic. I'm seeing an increased focus on this, and that's not just in the United States. So I would say working across many geographies, the US is certainly in many ways, partially I want to say leading the conversation, and partially I'm like so behind the times. But there's a lot of focus in North America on DEI, and we're starting to see other regions catch up. So in Europe, for example, the concept of diversity has been seen a little bit as an Americanized concept, but as Europe becomes more diverse, as immigrant populations become a more meaningful part of the culture and of society, we're starting to see countries shift away from that and be more thoughtful about the way that they provide equity for those minoritized groups. And then I think what I see in APAC is that while that market is still beginning to think about it, that there's a lot of room for growth. And one of the biggest areas that I see, and this is true across every geography, is that companies tend to be at the very beginning of their DEI journey. So a lot of the many companies come to Culture Amp to help them with their DEI strategies. And where most organizations are is that they're just beginning to collect data on it. And so they haven't necessarily even collected that diversity data, so demographics. So asking the question of like, who's in our organization and are they progressing equitably? But organizations also aren't yet consistently measuring inclusion or measuring the experience that people are having at work. And what we know, and this sounds very silly. Oh, sorry, I have a fluffy assistant that's joining us. But what we're seeing is that organizations that measure hi, can you lay down? Can you lay down? Come on. Sorry about that. But so what we're seeing is that organizations that measure the effectiveness and the ROI of their DEI programs are more likely to be successful. And when you say this, it feels a little bit like a kind of silly, almost, of course, Aubrey, comment. But so many companies think about this as like a squishy, feelingsy thing to do. And it involves empathy, it involves feelings of belonging and subjective experience, like certainly, but it can be driven in the same way that any other type of business priority or cultural transformation can be accomplished. And so another thing to note is that while there are a lot of DEI best practices, not every best practice is appropriate for every organization. And so you need to be collecting data so that you can understand, like, what are the particular gaps in your organization and how do you solve for those? So companies, as an example, companies often start with employee resource groups or communities for employees. But an ERG in and of itself isn't going to solve a pay inequity issue, right? And so you need to audit your pay programs to say, is that the gap we have? Because an ERG is not going to solve it. If your gap is that people don't feel connected, that they don't have a sense of belonging, well, then ERGs would actually be a great solution for that problem. And so I think it goes back to collecting data, because almost every company under-resources DEI. And so with that data, DEI professionals are better able to prioritize what limited resources they have towards the areas of the business where it's going to have the biggest impact. So, for example, at Culture Amp, this means that we primarily in our DEI program focus on disabled employees and on BIPOC employees, because our data shows us that our gender equity work and our LGBTQ equity work has actually been effective, to the point where, you know, women and queer folks at Culture Amp are doing well. They feel that they're treated equitably. We like audit their processes, so we feel confident that their outcomes are equitable. But we haven't necessarily seen that historical experience for BIPOC and disabled folks. So from our BIPOC population, a lot of it was around representation. So the employees we had actually felt great. They felt like they were having a good experience at Culture Amp, but they didn't necessarily see people who look like them when they look up the ladder. And, you know, and so at Culture Amp, we set an intentional goal of 8% of all of our hires this year identifying as Black or Indigenous, and 30% of our senior leader hires identifying as BIPOC. And we did that because that was the specific gap that we saw in our data. And then we also have a goal where we saw that our disabled employees were not having the same positive experience that many of our other folks were, and that they were much less likely to say that they could see themselves working at Culture Amp in 2 years' time. And so we have a goal that's specifically around improving disabled employees saying that they want to be here in 2 years. And so we're developing accommodations and adjustment programs, investing in the disabled community at Culture Amp. We're encouraging disabled senior leaders to be more visible and open about their disabilities, so that disabled employees can see people like them, that it's totally possible to be disabled and a senior leader. And what we're hoping is over the next 6 to 12 months, those investments will improve the experience of disabled people. But if we weren't using that data to drive change, we might just be investing in a women's leadership program because that's what everybody does, when in fact, we don't have a gap in terms of women achieving leadership at Culture Amp in the same way. And so that's not the right investment, and our data tells us how to prioritize that. And I would wish that for every company that wants to make progress or wants to be successful in this work, which is measure, test, measure, test, measure, test.
That's great. And yeah, I just think that inclusivity as a whole and everybody feeling comfortable in an organization is, I think it's a dream to have, right? And it's a dream company for even employees to work at. So yeah.
That is the hope. I would say, you know, one of the other pieces that I always tell leaders is companies like to say, like, we are inclusive, or like, we are equitable, or like, we are anti-racist. And I always tell people, don't say you are something. Say that you're invested in being something, or you're working towards the goal of being X, Y, Z, especially if you're sitting in a position of leadership or power. Because the fact is, like, you don't know if the experience is actually inclusive for that marginalized person. But what you can, and that in some ways can break down trust, right? You know, so if your employer brand is like, we're so inclusive, and then someone comes in and has a crappy experience, they're going to be immediately turned off, lose trust. Whereas if the way that you talk about your work is you say, we are intending to create this experience, it creates space for someone to say, that didn't happen for me. And for them to have that addressed, to say, oh shit, that was not what we wanted for you. How do we make that right? how do we improve from this so that that situation doesn't happen to you again? Because in my experience, most folks who are marginalized, even being told like, you're totally right, that was shitty, like we want to make it better, that is a meaningfully different experience than they've had before. And at the end of the day, I think we're all aware that like no situation is perfect, but what we want is the freedom to make it right and to be able to thrive in a place.
Definitely, yeah. So, what's under the hood for workplace diversity and inclusion technology? Will more tech actually tackle these issues, or it will just like add to them? What do you think?
I think it depends on how they're designed. So I think that we see a lot of technology that ends up, re-entrenching a lot of the existing societal biases that we have. So we see, sentencing algorithms that are disproportionately harsh to Black folks within the criminal justice system, for example. We see like resume sorting that like keeps millions of like really qualified, awesome people out of even entry-level jobs because of, quite frankly, just how poor the technology is. But we also see ways that technology can help interrupt structural biases. So I'm really excited about the potential for, AI and machine learning to impact software that provides feedback. So how do we identify that, women are more often to be given personality versus skills-based feedback? How do we actually use technology to identify that and provide nudges to the people that are providing that feedback to say, hey, your feedback is looking a little sexist. Could you adjust it? So I think that there's things like that. I think technology that takes, that's looking at performance reviews or feedback and is auditing those to say, are the distributions of performance rates equitable at this organization? Or are men more likely to get higher skewed ratings than women? If you could identify that pattern before it impacted people's promotion and their pay opportunities, when you can say, this is a little off, let's adjust it. I think that those are the type of things that like keep me up at night in a good way, in that not of all of these things in, one of the other areas I'm really interested in is like environmental sustainability and equity. And you think about like the scale of those intractable problems and how hard they are, like auditing your performance reviews is not that hard. It's not even that technically complex. And so I think that's why I get excited, is because while I think there is a huge open market for technology to be taking a bigger swing outside of the recruiting space on these issues, I also see that the problems are like taking a chunk out of these problems is approachable and technically possible. So that makes me really optimistic about, say, the next 5 years of what we're going to see in technological innovation, especially how it relates to education and cultural transformation.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I think the thing that you touched upon, like, and that's not just with recruiting. I guess that's the issue even with people asking for loans or credit scores or all these things. These biases are everywhere, where it's just hidden and nobody realizes that it's still going on in that same pace and in the same way, where even people asking for loans do not get a loan just because your system tells that they are not eligible while they are actually eligible. So these biases need to like, and I think that's a lot of scope for technology to grow in that part, where even technology becomes more and more inclusive. Because let's say I'm like, I don't face racism in India, at least when I'm sitting, but when it's somebody brown or just a shade who is darker than me, that's all it is. And when they would not get a same opportunity being equally smart or even more smarter than me, then it does not make sense. So yeah, I mean, I will never understand what other people would go through because I am not that person. So that will never come under my observation until somebody comes and tells me that, you know what, this happened to me. So people need to understand that, and people need to empathize that these issues exist. And once they acknowledge at least these issues exist, then I think that's half part of the solution. And then the rest is obviously, which is operational, and people can bring it out and grow it out. But yeah.
Yeah, but I think you make such an important point, is that to like loop back that comment to what you were talking about at the very beginning of our conversation is that we talk about there's like this fundamental ignorance, and even, you know, the pattern of giving, you know, sexist or personality based feedback to women. That's not something that men just do. That's actually something that we all do to women. And so I think that's another way that technology, like, I think you're right, you need empathy, but your point about needing awareness before you can have empathy is just so spot on in that. And so I think technology can identify these like really subtle behavioral patterns that are basically impossible for us to be aware of on a conscious level. I think there's other patterns that we can learn that are more macro, that are more on the surface, that we should learn how to be aware of. And that's like our personal responsibility. But how do we think about letting people do the empathizing where they are aware, and then deploying technology to help us where we don't yet have the capacity or the knowledge that we would need in order to engage empathetically? So I think your point is beautiful. And it's this like yes and that we need both. And I think that's true of most technology, is that human computer like symbiosis or interaction moment is where the magic actually happens.
That's great. So any other sound bites that you would like to share with our audience?
So I think if there's like one piece of advice I give to everyone, and a little bit inspired by some of the questions that you've asked, which is don't do nothing. So whatever you do, don't do nothing. So whether that's saying, you know, maybe you're at the beginning of your journey and you're just saying, I just want to know more about what the words diversity, equity, and inclusion mean. Great. Go check out the Culture Ant blog. We've got tons of content for you. Go read on Google. Go change your social media feed so you're not just following a bunch of cishet white dudes. Ask whether pay equity auditing is happening at work. If you're a hiring manager, demand that you see a balanced slate of candidates before you'll give out a job offer. If you are an underrepresented person, ask how you're being treated in the workplace. Go look and see what programs are being offered for you. So when like my piece of advice is like do something and do the next right thing in front of you. You don't have to solve all of structural exclusion by Thursday, but you do have to do something by Thursday. And pick your next Thursday. Who knows what day of the week you're experiencing this? There will always be another Thursday.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Aubrey. I think I really love talking to you. And I think this is something that is the need, and more that people realize that earlier, much more results they'll be able to see. So thank you so much for taking up the time and having this chat with me. I'm really blessed that Kim is busy today, so that I got to have this conversation. I'm super happy that this happened. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for this, Drishti. You've had so many wonderful questions, and I feel like we've covered so much material and all of this. And I'm just hopeful that what people get out of this conversation, that, you know, you and I obviously have been thinking about these topics for a while, is like, there are things that you can do, and you have a lot of the skills already to do them. So go deploy those skills and make the world a little bit better. That would be what I want people to take out of the whole time.
Thank you so much. I think audience is really going to enjoy this interview. So we'll be back with a new episode with a brand new expert soon. So stay tuned, everyone, and we'll see you around for the next one. Thank you, Aubrey.